right, hello everyone. I hope you're enjoying your day today. So, as I said before, I am out today with some other work I need to do at a conference. So, I decided to put this up for you all to watch. So, make sure you've done the reading for class and then come and listen to this lecture. Today's lecture is going to be on identity and hard conversations. It's going to be adding on to our conversation about who we are that we talked about last week. So today we'll be talking about hard conversations and then next time how to make them easier. So let's get started. The agenda for today then, I'll be talking about a little bit more of identity theft, what that is, why it can be a problem in organizations, some of the current problems we're seeing in organizations when it comes to failure to have difficult conversations. Specifically, we're going to look at the Netflix example that I gave you all for class and one of the problems that they were experiencing there. And then finally, how to have better conversations and effective dialogue when identity is part of the conversation. All right, as a just kind of quick admin for you all, this week we'll be talking about hard conversations, safe and easy at work. So that will be my lecture today and then my lecture for Wednesday. Next week, we'll be talking about relationships at work and in life. That will be basically my final lecture. Just some final words of, thoughts, wisdom that I would like to give to you all before class ends. I'll also give you some time during that class to then work on your idea project if that is what you're deciding to do. So as of right now, start working on the final assignment if that's what you are wanting to do. If not, make sure you're starting to look over the slides, put together your notes for the final exam. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's talk about identity at work. So why talk about identity? Well, as we can see in a lot of organizations, there's this renewed focus on inclusion after this post-social movement and workplace misconduct that we've seen in previous years. And we find that most Fortune 1000 companies have a DEI executive. Maybe they've changed the names over time, but basically these are people to deal with bias and inequality within the workplace. And so when it comes to leading a diverse organization, to be a leader of a company, conversations about identity are necessary for justice and fairness. And so a lot of Fortune 1000 companies have these people that are here to deal with bias and inequality. And however, we're still seeing that they're not always working as well as they should. There was a study done in 2021 by Pollock et al., which they found, quote, much research effort is theoretically and empirically misguided if the aim is to provide actionable, robust, evidence-based recommendations for reducing prejudice in the workplace. And so by analyzing these different corporations, what these researchers found is that a lot of the training that these companies are doing are actually not very effective, that they're not reducing bias in the workplace, and in some situations it's actually increasing bias. And so this is something we have to kind of think about. Why are these trainings not effective? Why are they not achieving the goal that they're looking for, and in some situations actually making it worse? And so figuring out precisely how to confront inequality and prejudice is more complicated than what a lot of these organizations were doing, where they were like, well, if we just hire a diversity consultant, if we put someone in the DEI position, isn't that enough? And then we ask the workers to attend some, afternoon training session about, not how to be racist or not ask certain questions, whatever it is. That should just check off the box. We should be good. Everyone should know what to do. And what they're realizing, though, is that that doesn't actually work. Is that this, because it is a structural problem in, parts of our society and also in our organizations, that it's going to take more effort than just an afternoon session or just hiring one person to fix it. And so these complications were heightened because many people felt like discussing who we are poses real risks, that people who are usually of underrepresented groups feel like if they are going to be vulnerable about who they are, the experiences that they had, what it's like being a Black employee at this job or a woman or whatever, then they can maybe feel like they are being vulnerable, and that might lead to some risk of being like, oh, well, you're just overthinking it, or oh, we don't see you that way. And so we all know that using a racial slur is unacceptable, but when it comes to other kinds of dialogue, it can be hard to know what is out of bounds. kind of going back to the reading from today, that we know certain things are wrong and that we shouldn't do it, but there is a lot of gray area. And so how do we make the best decisions as leaders? And when there is confrontation within that gray area, how do we deal with it? And so this brings up a question for us. Okay, if we're going to ask people about their lives, if we are talking to our coworkers, how much can we ask our coworkers about their life beyond work, their beliefs, their identity, without running the risk of overstepping or feeling like we're going to get in trouble for it? And so with that, basically, how do we overcome the worry that saying the wrong thing or asking a naive question might destroy our friendship with that person or even destroy our careers, which is something that people don't want to feel when they are at a workplace. And so that's where we get into the conversation for today, which is about having hard conversations, something that Netflix had to do. And so think to yourself, how have you been in a recent discussion where you felt like you didn't fit in, where everyone was talking about some topic and maybe you didn't feel like you could join in, you didn't feel like you related to the experiences? Or have you been in a conversation where someone expressed prejudiced beliefs that you were against, or you knew that people would be against in general, that maybe was more controversial? Or have you ever heard someone make a joke about, people like you, or pretend to talk like you, or assume you were friends with someone because you have the same ethnicity or gender? These can all be seen as forms of microaggressions within organizations. And a lot of the times we might be in conversations where we don't feel like we fit in, or in the conversation that other people would not be able to fit in. And so when it comes to hard conversations, this is something that researchers have really started to look at. There's some studies that were done at Columbia and UC Berkeley looking at tough conversations and how can we actually be better at it. And what they found by these tough conversations when they were analyzing the data, asking people to have tough conversations, these topics involve politics and or religion, and that's usually what made the conversations hard. But what the researchers really emphasized is that tension is normal. It's going to be common for us to have hard conversations, whether it's at work or in our personal lives. And so as human beings and as leaders, we have to better understand how to have these conversations effectively, because we know that they are going to occur. And so what makes conversations hard? Well, maybe you're fearful that you're going to say the wrong thing. You're going to address someone in an incorrect way. You're going to then maybe get their name wrong, their pronouns wrong. Maybe you'll use an outdated term. There's a lot of different ways we can feel like maybe we're going to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. And uncertainty around what's out of bounds. What can I say and what can I not say? And conversations may threaten identity, creating a defensiveness and also a discomfort, where if they are then threatening the identity of you as an individual, that's going to create defensiveness in you and be like, well, I'm not like that. Why would you say that? And that creates discomfort, and that leads to more tension. And that's what can make conversations hard, is that sometimes we don't know what is the right thing to say, and we don't know really where the boundaries are. Kind of going back to a conversation we had a couple weeks ago, looking at, what's this really about conversation, where you have to kind of learn what are the rules of the conversation. It's the same when we're having difficult conversations at work. So with these studies they did at Columbia and UC Berkeley, they would listen in on people's conversations. And what they would find is that what led to some of the contention in the conversations is that whoever was speaking would assign the listener membership in a group that they did not like. So things they heard was like, oh, well, you're rich, so you know that most rich people are snobs. And so the listener would be offended by the insinuation that they were snobbish. Like, oh, you have money, so you must be a snob. You're making an assumption about that individual. Or we'd see things like, oh, you didn't go to law school, so you don't understand how the law actually works. And again, the listener would be offended by the accusation that they were uninformed. Like, oh, because you're not part of this identity, you're not smart enough, you're not competent enough, you're not going to understand this. And so again, people would feel hurt, and that would create more defensiveness. And sometimes the comments were indirect, where they have comments saying, oh, well, you're one of the good Republicans, but most of them only care about themselves. Or you got into that college because you're smart, but some people like you get in because of affirmative action. Again, insinuating that maybe they are part of a group that's not as good, or that they aren't as smart or as competent as others. And what they found in the research is that the person commenting usually doesn't know they were being offensive. Like with comments saying, oh, since you don't have kids, you might not understand how a parent feels seeing a child treated that way. And these are things that I've heard in my life too, where someone made a comment to me about working at a public college or working and like getting the rankings of a public college as someone they themselves went to private universities. And regardless of the phrasing that they, used in this example here with the kids or in my personal example, the result was consistent. We felt angry about it and there was alienation, and eventually the conversation just fell apart. And so with this, we have to understand identity threat and when it occurs. And it occurs when someone is grouped in a way that they reject, that they feel like they are being put into a group that they don't want to be a part of, or they are not being put in a group that they want to be a part of. So basically, they're grouped in a way that they reject or excluded from a group that they value. And so you can probably think about times as this happened to you, where someone said like, oh, you are in this group and that made you not feel happy, or they removed you from a group that you felt like you were a part of. And that can make us feel angry, upset, or frustrated with that individual. I have an example of this too, where I was at a party once and I was talking to an individual I just met there. I told them that I worked at the university. I was a faculty member at the university, and they responded by going like, oh, in the Women and Gender Studies department. And then I was offended by that because, no, I don't work in the Women and Gender Studies department. I work in the management department. And so I was offended that I was grouped into a group that I'm not a part of. And no offense to that department. I feel like they'd probably feel the same way if it happened to them in reverse. But again, it was like, no, that's not my group. I'm part of a different group. And so these can actually trigger strong emotional and psychological responses, and they can be corrosive to communication and trust. And we can see that this happens a lot in our lives. Back when I lived in Arizona, I drove a truck there. I really miss it. I actually think about, how can I get this truck back? I had a 2004 Toyota Tacoma. It was a dual cab TRD red, loved the car. And so one time in grad school, I was going to my advisor's house to pick up some supplies for a conference that she was hosting. And so I was showing her how I can then move some things in the bed of the truck to make it a little bit larger and how it actually worked. And when I explained how it would work to her and showed her on the back of the truck, she just put her hands in the air and she said, I don't get redneck cars. And that was really offensive to me. Like, how dare you say that I'm a redneck because I drive a truck? Like, you're asking for my help. And so that created a lot of tension in my relationship with that individual because they were putting me into a group that I did not want to be a part of. And so this is something that happens consistently in our lives. And in that situation, that happened with basically my supervisor, my boss at work said that about me. And it really created some tension in our relationship. And Michael Slepin, right here, he's a researcher that looks at identity threat. He's done a lot of work on this, and he says, quote, when someone says you don't belong or they put you in a group you don't appreciate, it causes extreme psychological discomfort, like the examples I just gave you. When people confront identity threats, what they find is that their blood pressure can rise, their bodies can become flooded with stress hormones, and they begin looking for ways to escape or fight back. Basically to get out of the conversation, to get out of the organization, or to retaliate. Both are things you don't want to have happen. And so that gets us into the case study for today, looking at Netflix. And so in the paper I asked you to read for this class, it talked about how Netflix had created this structure where there was basically no rules at Netflix. And the creator of Netflix had created this 100 plus, PowerPoint slide about all the things that Netflix does and how it was very clear at Netflix that if you were having a problem, if you weren't doing the best job, they were very clear about that to you. And when anyone was fired, they would send out an email to everyone in the organization explaining why that person got fired. And so in the paper, they talk about how some people really enjoyed that. It was very clear to them if someone was angry at them, they would let them know. While other people found it to be extremely stressful in that type of culture. And so the example I gave you all, it kind of centers around when one of the executives used a slur in a meeting and how the organization responded to it and how he eventually used the slur again in another situation and was let go. And so some people in the organization thought that was the right thing to do, that, we shouldn't be having people that are treating, the black employees as second class citizens or making them feel that way. While other individuals look at the situation was like, well, he made a mistake. Aren't we allowed to make mistakes? Like, I thought we're supposed to not have rules. Why are there now rules? And so this started creating some contention at Netflix. So they're like, okay, maybe we need to start making a change here, or figure out how we can better understand what people need and how to have better conversations. And so when some Netflix employees accused their coworkers of being oversensitive or not Netflix material because they were offended by what this executive said, it felt like they were being accused as if they were being forced into a group. That if I complained that the executive used this type of terminology, or that I don't see a lot of diversity in leadership, those people were then being forced into a group of petulant complainers. Like, you're just going to complain about anything. You don't even care about the company. You just want to find something to be upset about. And so you were forcing people in a group that they didn't want to be a part of. And they were being excluded from other groups, like those prepared to succeed at Netflix. That if people were then criticizing these decisions, those individuals were usually not given opportunities to then work on larger projects, or to then, get options for, promotions within the organization. Which the idea is that everyone wanted to belong, but what Netflix had created as a culture, people were being forced into groups where they didn't feel like they belonged. And then when those who had been criticized as being complainers responded by arguing that their critics' comments came from a place of privilege and were themselves evidence of racial insensitivity, again, we saw a similar problem. It felt to the critics like they were being lumped into a group with a bunch of racists and bigots, which made them defensive in response. And so both sides were putting people into groups that they did not want to be a part of, and that was creating more contention within Netflix. That people were then being assigned identities that they did not agree with, and that was actually causing them to be more defensive and aggro towards one another. And when it comes to understanding identity threat, we have to understand that this happens a lot. That in a recent study done in 2021, they found that people experience about 11.38 identity threats each week. That across, what they said in the study, across 40% of our observations, participants felt threatened on a single identity, and 60% perceived being threatened on multiple identities. So to better understand identity threat, researchers have created a model to look at it. That by telling someone that they belong to a group that they abhor, so for example, my advisor saying that I was a redneck because I drove a truck, that triggers identity threat. That you're being put into identity that you don't want to be associated with, and that threatens your own view of yourself. And that identity threat then causes defensiveness, that we get on the defensive, trying to then make it so we are not part of that group, that we try to argue against that. That then prompts possibly counterattacks, where you say, okay, well, you say I'm like that, well, that means you're like this. And you put the person then into a group that they abhor. And so that's what we saw at Netflix, is that employees started to speak out about the problem. Other employees were like, well, you guys are just perpetual complainers. You're going to find anything to be a problem. That triggered an identity threat in those employees, that they were being put into a group of, not being team players and just being hard to work with. That made them defensive, and that prompted them to engage in counterattacks in the form of telling those individuals, well, you are just being racist, you're being bigots for then not supporting us. And so this whole cycle would continue. And so going back to the studies done on this, what they've found in the research is that people experience identity threats due to where they lived, where they work, who they were married to, who they were dating, where they had been born, how they spoke, how much money they earned, and a dozen other reasons, like what kind of car they drove. And so what they also found is that being rich or white or straight or any what's seen as a more privileged group in a lot of cultures, that didn't protect them, that those individuals were also experiencing identity threat. While also finding that being poor or black or part of some other, marginalized community meant that they confronted identity threats as often as every day. And so think to yourself, how can this be a problem when we need to talk about systematic issues at work like discrimination? That's something that we have to consider, is that when we're having these conversations, it's important to understand what identities that person has and making sure that we're not creating more identity threat. And that this can actually affect our own social circles. Is that if we are then only engaging with people who are like us, then we might not better understand other groups and other people's experiences. So here we have a quick class writing activity. So what I'd ask you to do is to pull out a sheet of paper, and I'm going to give you 3 prompts that I want you to respond to. So the first one, write down some benefits you think can happen from talking about race with friends or different racial groups. Next, what, if anything, might get in the way of you and a friend experiencing these benefits in the conversation? And then finally, what can you do to help overcome these obstacles and experience these benefits? So, you can pause the video right now and answer these questions here and, think about what your answers would be. So that activity I asked you to do is actually tied to a study they did looking at hard conversations, specifically conversations between Black and white friends, where the researchers asked friend dyads, where there was one Black friend and one white friend, to talk about, quote, something you experienced recently that is related to your race or ethnicity. And they put the participants into 2 groups. They had the control group, where there was no prep, they were just given the questions and asked to answer them, and the experimental group, where they were given the class activity that I just gave you to answer those 3 questions. And so what they found is that in the control group, the conversations were much shorter, they were much quicker, and the participants started talking about different topics. They didn't want to talk about, prejudice that they've experienced or identity threats that they had in their lives. They didn't want to have those types of conversations. Whereas in the experimental group, what they found is that these dyads were willing to have longer conversations. And by the end of it, they said that they actually felt closer to one another. That it led to more dramatic moments, big revelations, and passionate outbursts. That those in the experimental group started, crying, they would hug each other, they would maybe laugh about certain things. And so what they found is that by prepping people to have these types of conversations, understanding that it's going to be difficult, there's going to be parts of it that won't be fun, it actually led to better outcomes, that these individuals felt closer and that they had bonded at a deeper level. And so the researcher that looked at this, Kira Sanchez, she said, quote, when you listen to the conversations, you hear a lot of support. That must have hurt. I'm sorry that happened to you. It's awful that you were discriminated against. Sometimes just acknowledging someone's experiences and feelings can make a big difference. And the experimental group was much better at doing that because they had basically primed themselves to have these conversations more effectively. So overall, what advice do we have for leaders and for you all as future leaders when it comes to this research and what we learned from Netflix? Well, if you know you're going to have a challenging conversation at work, there are certain things that you can do. Preparing for a conversation before it begins is the number one thing. Thinking just a little bit more when you open your mouth. Basically, what is it that you are going to want to say in this conversation? And maybe even anticipating obstacles. Plan for what you're going to do when they arise, and consider what you hope to say, and think about what might be important to other people. This is the same thing I do when I'm having challenging conversations. I usually write down ahead of time what it is that I want to say, what it is that I want to get out. So that in the moment when I'm having that conversation, I know that I've, composed my thoughts, I know what I'm going to say, and I can say it in a way that feels authentic to me. And so by doing that, you can then be ready for the conversation. And again, anticipating obstacles that may arise is going to be a huge benefit. What are the things you think other people are going to say that might be challenging? What are some of the topics that are going to be hard to address? Getting those figured out ahead of time is going to help you be more prepared. And so before any challenging conversation, think about 1, what you hope will happen. Also, 2, what might go wrong, and 3, how you'll react when it does. This is something that we can do in many situations when it comes to challenging conversations. Even if you're planning a big event, what do you want to have happen? What might go wrong? And how are you going to react in those situations when it does? And so again, kind of building on these conversations. It's the same thing I asked you all to do for the class activity, where you say, okay, what might go wrong in these situations? And if emotions start to get tense, if people get angry or upset or annoyed, how are we going to react in those situations? How are we going to make sure that we are being effective as a team? And then number 2, just because we're worried about a conversation, that doesn't mean we ought to avoid it. That we are going to have hard conversations in our work life and our personal life. It is unavoidable. Or if you try to avoid it, you're going to have a much harder time, building relationships with people. And so with this, we need to deliver, if you need to ever deliver disappointing news to a friend, complain to a boss, discuss something unpleasant with a coworker, these are the things that we're going to see in our lives. And we can reduce that tension by reminding ourselves why this conversation is important. That, yeah, I know this conversation is going to be hard with my loved one about how how they're treating me, or complaining to my boss about a coworker. I know this is not going to be an easy conversation. But if I can look at the end goal of that conversation, it's going to be very motivating. That acknowledging to ourselves and others that these conversations are going to be helpful. And that it can be like, okay, we know this is going to be a tough conversation, but by the end, we all hope that to feel better and to feel heard. And then next, think about how a conversation will occur is just as important as what is going to be said. So think to yourself, who's going to speak first? Advice I give to you is that the person with the least amount of power should usually speak first in those situations. And then what kind of emotion should we anticipate? Are people going to feel angry, upset? Are they going to cry? Are they going to, be reactive? What's going to happen? And then also, what obstacles should we expect? And when they emerge, what will we do? Will there be discomfort or tension with that? And then how will we actually deal with those situations? And then what benefits do we expect will emerge from this dialogue? And are they worth the risks? And that's something you do have to consider is that, okay, if I'm going to have this tough conversation, there is some risk associated with it, and is it worth the reward? And I can tell you again from my own personal experiences working in an organization, I've had times where I've wanted to have a tough conversation with a leader, with a coworker. But when I do a cost-benefit analysis and I look at the risk associated with it, I realize that sometimes it's just not worth having those conversations. That I don't feel like I'm going to be heard or that they're going to take me seriously, and that my time would be better used somewhere else and possibly at a different job. So here are some questions to ask yourself before the conversation begins. How do you hope things will unfold? How do you want the conversation to go? How will this conversation start? Again, who will speak first? What will you address first? Acknowledging at the beginning of the conversation that this is going to be a tough conversation, but that's important. What obstacles might emerge? What are the tension points that we're going to have to address? When those obstacles appear, what is your plan to overcome them? So that could be even something that you write down to yourself, certain talking points, things that you want to make sure are addressed. And again, what are the benefits of this dialogue? That, yeah, it's a lot of work, it's going to be tough, but I know in the end, if it goes well, these are the things that we can expect. The next piece of advice I would give you is to avoid generalizations and instead speak about your own experiences and emotions. The thing that we are the expert in is our own experiences and the emotions that we feel. Don't generalize the situation. Don't say well, everyone like you is stupid, or, well, because you're part of this group, you don't understand what we're dealing with. That's just going to lead to more identity threats. And again, identity threats typically emerge because we generalize. We lump people into groups or assign others traits they loathe. And these generalizations take all of us, our unique perspectives and complicated identities, out of the conversation. They basically make us one-dimensional. That, oh, because you're part of this group, you are this. Basically, you're creating that stereotype. And like we've talked about in class, the stereotype is not that it is incorrect, it's that it is incomplete. And so, again, we have to really be careful not to generalize when we're having these challenging conversations. That's going to lead to identity threat, defensiveness, and counterattacks, and eventually the conversation is just going to fall apart. And when we describe our own experiences in these challenging conversations, our experiences, our feelings, our reactions, we start to get rid of these identity threats. And that because, again, we are experts in our own experiences and our own emotions. But this does require some work that we have to avoid generalizations, me not only describing ourselves with honesty, but also listening closely to other companions so we can hear their specific pain and frustration. That it's easy for us to, express sometimes our own experiences, feelings, and reactions, and sometimes it can be hard, though, to listen to other people who are trying to do the same thing. That we can hear their specific pain and their frustration about what it is that they're going through and how the situation is affecting them. And when it comes to these types of conversations, don't give in to the temptation to minimize someone's struggles or try to solve their problems simply because witnessing their discomfort is so difficult. And this happens a lot, that when people are upset or annoyed, that our kind of human reaction sometimes is just to fix the problem, to kind of not really listen, but just try to fix it so we don't have to talk about it or ignore it. And so we must not imply that because we have not personally experienced their suffering, it therefore is not real. And again, this happens a lot in organizations where employees come up to leaders and say, hey, I don't feel comfortable around this person, or they don't make me feel like I'm being seen or that I feel safe. And that the leader or the coworker may respond defensively and be like, well, I've never experienced it with that person, or, oh, they've always been really nice to me. And in that situation, you are minimizing what they're trying to say there. And just because you personally have experienced the suffering doesn't mean that it's not real. People are going to have different experiences. And so applying these lessons as leaders, understand that leaders set the tone, that when you are having these difficult conversations, as the leader, you get to set the tone of the conversation. You get to be in charge of it. And what I'd recommend to all of you is to model vulnerability and openness in the conversation. If you are willing to be vulnerable, then other people are going to be vulnerable as well. Again, that's something that I try to do in the classroom and in this lecture here, is I try to be vulnerable about times that I've experienced identity threat and how it's affected me. And if I can be vulnerable and then do that in these conversations, hopefully other people will feel the same way. Also, create psychologically safe spaces where employees can share their stories. Create an environment where employees feel like they can then express their ideas, but also tell you about how they feel, about their experiences, and that they don't feel like they're going to be shot down or it's going to be minimized or that people are going to get defensive in reaction to it. And acknowledge that identity impacts workplace experiences. That we like to think that, we're all employees, that we're all going to have the same experience at work, but that's actually not true. And that as leaders, we need to acknowledge that identity influences our interactions at work. That's not something we can just leave at the door when we come into an organization. Also, make sure to establish group norms that discourage generalization and encourage listening. So as the leader, you need to make sure that these identity threats are not occurring. And the best way to do that is by being careful yourself not to do it. And to make sure that you are creating norms that discourage others from generalizing and putting people into groups that they don't want to be a part of. And encourage your coworkers, your employees, to listen to one another from an aspect of trying to understand, not try to fix. And so encourage speaking from personal experiences rather than assumptions. Everyone is, again, an expert in their own personal experiences. Try to focus on that, then the assumptions that can lead to identity threat. And then responding to identity threat as a leader, when this occurs within your organization, recognize and validate when someone feels misunderstood or excluded. That maybe you won't understand the experience, but you can acknowledge it. Like we saw in the study where they looked at the dyads of the white friend and the black friend, that was like, I'm sorry that happened to you. That sounds hard. That sounds very difficult. I'm here to, support you. So recognize that it happened and validate their experience. Again, don't get immediately defensive saying like, well, I would never do that, or, oh, that person isn't like that to me, or, oh, the company does care about you. you are, in a sense, not validating what they're trying to say. So avoid immediate defensiveness. Listen first. That's the job. Then ask clarifying questions to get more idea of what happened. Okay, this employee said this thing to you that made you feel uncomfortable. Had there been other experiences of this that can help bring some light to this conversation? Have there been other times where you don't feel like you belong? What are things that you would like me as a leader to do to help support you? And so offer space for repair, apologize when you have some blame in the situation, facilitate dialogue between the conflicting parties, and have supportive resources, whether that is through HR, whether that is through therapy, whether that is through workshops. Have resources allocated to then mitigating these problems. Also, things you can do is use anonymous feedback tools to surface unseen tension. This is something that we do at the university, where if you have tension or you have criticism of classes, you're allowed to do that, and it's anonymous. We don't know who sent it. We sometimes even do that as employees here, that we give feedback about leadership here, and it's all anonymous. And it's a way for us to then bring up tensions that maybe we don't feel comfortable doing in a very kind of public situation. And also align performance evaluations with inclusive behaviors, not just outcomes. That we should really be looking at how leaders are creating an inclusive environment, not just what kind of, sales that they're making or how their team did on a metric level. Because if you start looking at it like that, people might feel like they're being exploited. And so I had a whole class activity here. We'll skip that for today. Not something we can really do in a video session. All right, thank you all for listening. Next lecture will be how to have hard conversations in a safe way. So for that class, I'm going to ask that you read The Problem Netflix Lives With Part 2. It is the second part of the reading for this lecture. It's going to focus on Verna Meyer and some of the work that she did at Netflix. So I'll be talking about that in the next lecture, and some of the guidelines that Netflix has put together, that even though they're still dealing with problems at their corporation, they are able to have better conversations based off of these guidelines and the things that they've put together. So hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for listening, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions, comments, or concerns.